CitizenCon is weird. It's a convention for a game that is nowhere near release, and it's about to hit 9 years. But over those 9 years, the idea behind the event has shifted, going from primarily a marketing event to something much more informative. Today I will give you the full history of that shift and all the details behind it. This is the full history of CitizenCon, the successes, the failures, and the controversies. It is the September supporter exclusive video, and if you aren't a supporter already, consider joining to see all of my exclusive videos released every month. If you are, well, thank you for supporting my Tomato Talks. The very first CitizenCon event was held in Austin, Texas. It was pretty unprofessional and pretty haphazard, to be honest. Definitely had that small indie dev feeling of not knowing how to best fill the hour. It was almost like a long around the verse filled with anything and everyone. Concept art, the ships, the team, the birthday occasion, offices, everything was pretty casually shared throughout the event time. There were many familiar faces there too, such as Benoit and Turbulent, who were building the web infrastructure for the project at the time. Not server meshing just yet. The CitizenCon was where Chris made official the CitizenCon tradition, every year in October marking the anniversary of the Kickstarter launch of Star Citizen. Besides those introductions, everything was mainly about the immediate future. Long-term news just wasn't really in the cards yet. The event gives us the best view of where Star Citizen came from, as it hasn't always been this big project. Some of these updates came from studios and people no longer involved in the project, and some highlights were parts of the game that are no longer included either. Overall, 2013 felt like it had the least direction. In 2014, we saw more celebrations of funding and more introductions of team members. The show was focused on ensuring the studios are moving forward with some level of productivity, but overall there was still not much shape to the messaging outside of that. Around the Verse was celebrated as just starting that year, later to be replaced by Inside Star Citizen, and 10 for the Chairman was a thing, the perfect engine for feature creep. But for the most part, the current goals seem to be about fan interaction and just keeping the community engaged. In all honesty, it was hard to see a game being built just by watching those video productions throughout the year. CitizenCon was what was meant to dive more into that stuff at the time. One key thing to remember from this year was the introduction of the Crytek engineers into the fold. CIG had struck gold managing to pick up CryEngine developers when Crytek was struggling financially at the time. This helped expand the game and make the progress of development more robust. A large focus was also on showing what felt like proofs of concept, though they were being presented as game assets. We saw several locations like the Shubin facility we know is still in Squadron 42. Overall, 2014 was still very rough in production, disjointed, but enthusiastic. Still a very indie feel. There were plenty of reasons given for the long development time and how things were going, but we'll hear more about that over the next 8 years. Ultimately, the 2-hour show ended with 20 minutes of what was described as a prototype of the persistent universe. It was a glitchy on-the-rails landing into the Area 18 location module. This predated any planets in the game whatsoever, and was basically just eye candy. "2015 was slightly larger and slightly more put together. It started out with the same sort of summary of the past before moving on to the real show. We saw that the Frankfurt office had started up with the Crytek developers, the Arc Star map was unveiled for the website, hardware partnerships were announced that, unfortunately, I don't think made it to market, and there were also of course new ships unveiled and new sales announced. Major news saw Chris introduce the persistent universe as Star Citizen 2.0, with missions, ship interiors, and more. This was the first actual Star Citizen experience, and was around the time players started to get a tangible idea of what Star Citizen aimed to offer in the persistent universe. We saw classics like Port Olisar and Korea, all areas that are still in-game in much more interactive ways now. Well, besides Port Olisar. At the end of the demo, Chris actually said he didn't want to give dates because he was always off.
Don't want to give you dates because everyone gives me shit for giving you dates.
That was 7 years ago, and many predicted dates ago. This is likely part of why we don't actually hear from him as much anymore. But this was the first CitizenCon that felt like they had a true agenda prepared. Rather than just reviewing and talking about what was being done, we started to see the proper in-game activity and tangible releases that players had been dreaming about for the previous 3 years. We just didn't realize how much more there was to go. Keep in mind, at this point, most of the backers at the time that were active had voted on the game being expanded, so from there on, things began to change a lot. And of course, towards the end, we did get a Squadron 42 update with the infamous Answer the Call 2016 trailer. They will literally never live that down. No matter how successful this all is, that was just a bad move. We got a ton of detail about how the trailer was made, how the motion capture was going with actors, and some features from the big name actors that had been locked down for Squadron 42, which in hindsight isn't really what I would want to be seeing about a game that is planned to release the next year. While we did get the famous Morrow tour, that was mainly just an asset showcase. At this point, CitizenCon was really starting to take on the feel of a marketing event, something that was true before but not quite as pronounced as 2015 and beyond. "2016 was rough. Of course, with the format the same as the previous year, we got testimonials, staff updates, and what's going on in the offices. But then we started seeing some new things. They introduced Spectrum, and they talked about org functionality, even though we still have to run org stuff off-site. Spectrum has not done the best since this first introduction, in my opinion. We had a weirdly placed new ship sale before moving on to Squadron 42. In this update, we were told Squadron 42 was feature-locked.
Content and sort of feature lock now.
But there was plenty more to still be done. You can judge that statement for yourself, though. All chapters were in gray box stage, with a specific chapter being brought up to final shipping quality.
42 is all the chapters and gameplay features are at gray box or better. We are currently taking one of the chapters of the story all the way to what we would consider final shipping quality.
There was plenty of talk about making sure the game is done right and released in a great polished state, and basically it was going to be a bit later than that.
So that's my long-winded way of saying that as much as we wanted to have Squadron 42 for this year, is not going to be this year, because from the polish we need to do, it still needs a bit more time.
But that was 6 years ago, and this just aged so badly. It doesn't matter if things aren't sure, all of the communication during this event was just far too definite for the unsure state of the project at that time. We also received some updates on the game status at the time for a little while, as well as a look forward at the upcoming 3.0 update. This was all well and good since 3.0 was expected for the next year, but it didn't end up coming for another 14 months, and the presentation quickly turned into one of the worst communication mess-ups in the game's history, in my opinion. We were shown the plans for Alpha 3.1, which showed not a single vehicle or gameplay mechanic that made it into the 3.1 patch. We only just got refueling in 2022. Escort missions are still only technically in the game, and the whole sea still hasn't arrived. And why was this on the screen? Next, of course, was 3.2, containing salvage and repair, a feature in 3.18, and several ships that took longer to come to the game. The next logical step, of course, is 3.3, touting the addition of farming, rescue, and the Banu Merchantman, none of which is in the game, and other vehicles that took years longer to make it into the game as well. And the even more logical... Wait. That's right. We were supposed to go to 4.0 at that point. Oh boy. This was setting the expectation we would see the pyro system, the crucible, exploration gameplay, jump points, and more. This is just painful to watch at this point, and was irresponsible of the company to put out to the public, in my opinion, even if it was an internal roadmap. This was the roadmap for the next year from that point, with each patch representing a different quarter, for the year 2017. And he says not to hold him to dates, but it's 2022. 4.0 is still not here.
So, and our goal is, this is the roadmap going forward in, over next year. Again, please don't hold me to dates, because everyone goes, why do you say that, Chris? I'm like, oh. Anyway.
This is easily my biggest pain point in Star Citizen's history, and I hope that CIG never forgets it. Okay, now that rant is done, the next bit of the show was showing off Planet Tech. Now this is important to note. Nothing in this introduction to the showcase talks about gameplay, just the planet tech. Unfortunately, instead of showing planet tech, they used the dev time making an amazing demo that looked like promising gameplay for the future. This led to as much backlash as you'd expect, complete with a full commentary talking about the different gameplay elements that were being shown off in this planet tech demo. So yeah, we followed the not great Squadron 42 news with the not great roadmap with an unattainable game demo. This was the roughest CitizenCon I think the company has ever had. While 2016 was an improvement in presentation and content, it was terribly off base on every estimate, set expectations ahead on some things by more than 5 years, and tried too hard to hype up content that still wasn't existent. While this event marked another change from the old indie review events to more of a marketing and hype event, it also felt like the furthest CIG has strayed from the path. And in hindsight, a wake-up call on the status of the project. CitizenCon 2017 switched up the format of the convention for good, splitting the regular few hours across several different panels featuring various team members on the main stage. Unfortunately, there were other things being hosted at the same time, so there were sometimes empty presentations. The production of this event was much better, with proper coverage, better scheduling, and information availability, and more entertainment value. Though there is something to be said about putting too much into making this convention an entertainment event in this period of development, as opposed to a large progress update. That being said, the updated format of having more dev teams come out to speak led us to getting much better updates from different parts of the game, allowing us to learn more about what's going on and what's coming up. We got to see a lot of the big names at the company that are just now pushing out the major features they were talking about back then. On that note, many of the initiatives that began to be discussed around that time are just now starting to make it into the game. So it seems the team was finally starting to get an idea of how to technologically make this all happen, but they still underestimated the time it would take. And then there was the 2017 mess up, introducing the ability to claim land in-game but not specifying that that land couldn't actually be claimed until the game went live, someday far in the future. They coupled this discussion with base building, which was likely premature as well, and essentially created another reason for CitizenCon to rub people the wrong way. In the end, we still ended up getting a nice demo to see what they had planned for the game in the next year or two. Planets, moons, and spaceships. No fancy missions, no sandworm encounters, an actual demo in the actual, kind of playable game. It wasn't exactly what made it to the game, as again, this was a mock-up for the show, but it was at least representative of the next year or two, unlike the show in 2016. 2017 was a good year for the event. It still acted very much as a special event and marketing opportunity because the game itself still didn't really exist in any major way, but it really solidified the idea of CitizenCon as a multi-team progress update with a more formal tone. CitizenCon 2018 was huge, but right off the bat they tried to make it too big. CIG attempted to make the event so high production value that they needed to charge backers an additional $20 just to watch the extra content in the live stream online. This was bad. The entire industry latched onto this, as the game was not reputationally in a good state as it was. This caused backlash in the community as well, with many calling for the event to be kept smaller to avoid splitting the fan base. Many others lashed out in defense against this. It was a pretty bad look, and ultimately the company backed down from the plans and gave everybody full live access. Since then, every stage and panel at the event has been void of any charge. To be clear though, no matter what the extra content would be in the live stream, it was always free on YouTube after the event. So this year we started with the gameplay demo showing the gameplay we might expect in the coming year or two. Much of it ended up in the game, from the ships to the planet to the interactions to the mission, mostly. This was an upgrade to the previous shows in showing us actual working tech that would improve our experience and define the game going forward, as opposed to just showing us kind of a tech demo of what they're working on. The mission givers, the underground bunkers, the vehicles, the landing zones, they all came to the game in short order. We again got plenty of updates from different teams like Flight Experience, VFX, Planet Tech, and more. and ultimately saw a full day of progress reports on where things were and where they were headed. And then at the end of the show, we got a road to release from Chris, claiming what he feels would be the core parts of Star Citizen that needed to be delivered, not including all those things from 2016. We received confirmation that server meshing was their main target for technological achievement before the game would allow us to start seeing 1,000 players on a single planet or see everything persist across all of your play sessions. We are only now seeing this realized 4 years later, but it's key to see that this trajectory was set and followed from that time. Besides the organization stuff, they just keep kicking that can. And what about Squadron 42? Well, they claim to have wrapped up most of the things on that list we saw earlier, so things are sounding good, although the game itself was nowhere to be seen. Almost all technical hurdles were figured out, and the public roadmap leading all the way up to game release was going to be published soon. TM. Have a listen.
We're closing it down. All the remaining features were in content. And the last major technical hurdle that we were worried about on Squadron was object container streaming, which, as you know, we're almost ready to close out here on 3.3. So we don't have any major technical hurdles left on Squadron. So for us, it's a bit easier to get Squadron closed out than obviously Star Citizen that needs the server meshing and all the rest of stuff. So that's going. We're going to publish the public roadmap for you guys in December, all the way to completion of the project.
4 years later, and we actually haven't seen any gameplay since then. The game was nowhere near release ready, even at that point, and the beta milestone would be missed 2 years later. And looking at these various CitizenCons, you can see how people have lost trust in their predictions of Squadron 42. The trailer they did release for it that year was pretty cool, but it's the last official trailer we would ever see to date. 2019 was a very hype CitizenCon. It was also the last physical CitizenCon we've seen thus far. They continued with the panel format, going a step further in the quality of their demos and the information they were sharing. This event served as our introduction to the overall economic model, which still isn't really in the game. Ship Talk, which has been an annual tradition in CitizenCon ever since, where ship people talk about ship stuff. And Theaters of War. The 2019 CitizenCon mistake centers around the premature introduction of Theaters of War, a game mode meant to test out what combat scenarios could play out in the persistent universe without risking persistent universe playtime. It also comes off as a Trojan horse for the Star Citizen experience in the FPS world, but it's been held back by tech limitations and so far hasn't amounted to much. It was a good idea, carried by hype to an unnecessary announcement to continue encouraging backers. And it seems like every year, something had to take the responsibility of that role. We of course also had updates on Planet Tech, which was approaching its V4 launch, the initial version they wanted to continue carrying the game forward with, the audio engine that would be creating the sound effects around the game, and some other interesting tidbits. This event was definitely toned down from the last couple of years as an event, and seemed to focus more on the info again, while allowing in-person guests to enjoy themselves. What was new this year was the gameplay demo being split into 2 parts. It carried the recent tradition of showing more realistic gameplay in the next couple of years, but still used some tricks like AI planetary navigation, new missions, and atmospheric AI ship flight to sell an experience that players still can't find to this day. This was also our first visual introduction to jump gates and the pyro system, and the first time we saw pyro mentioned in CitizenCon. This was a better representation of the gameplay that the company was shooting for in the coming years, but still too focused on showing off the idea of the game and not what would actually be available to players. In 2020, CIG skipped CitizenCon after the pandemic changed their game plans for the year. This was convenient as the company was also definitely behind on delivering pyro and would be better off putting time towards getting back on track. Despite this, we did get a few updates: a lore-based Star Citizen Live, a hype video about the community, and a Squadron 42 update that was actually supposed to come out earlier near June. It was the first in a series of updates to the much anticipated and delayed game, as the communication surrounding the game had reached an all-time low and the desire to learn more an all-time high. Unfortunately, the update amounted to a deep dive into a single location of the game with no gameplay. They never released another update to Squadron 42 after that, and that was the last footage we've seen of the game as of now. There was no CitizenCon, but they still managed to roll out a mistake. It's a bummer. "2021 was CIG's take on a digital show. It was high production quality, straight to the point, and concise. It offered monumentally informative updates on some of the most important tech in the game, stuff that we had started hearing about earlier in that 2018 show. Persistence, the Gen 12 renderer, server meshing, and planet tech. We got a great understanding of how the underlying tech that would drive the game was meant to work, and we were told straight up from the devs themselves how work was going with these assets, the milestones they were going forward with, and how they were feeling about their process. We've seen updates on the ships that were discussed, the engine tech that was explained, the new outposts, planets, and systems that were introduced, and much of the virtual CitizenCon was able to strip out the extras that made the show an event and pivot the focus almost completely towards an update on the game itself. And it may have been just coincidence, but this was the right time to start doing that. With the game finally in a playable state and shipping meaningful updates, CitizenCon was losing its importance as a huge hype generator or marketing tool. There were some segments that still fell back on the hype-generating discussions of earlier years that definitely offered less tangible insight, but overall the show was mainly focused on explaining what was already known, rather than introducing something new and exciting. In the same vein, the keynote demo was more reserved to a style of gameplay the team was aiming for in the next major update. The gameplay was realistic, with features like the inventory system, looting, and planetary navigating AI all making it into the game since then. There are still some missing aspects like the improved weather system, more interactive shopkeeper, and the entirety of Pyro. This wasn't the perfect representation of the next year of gameplay, which I believe CitizenCon should represent, but it gave a very good idea of the near future when new outposts made it into the game. If you'd like to know more about when that may be, I have 2 videos available to you. Otherwise, I'd say 2021 was a good step forward for this event. CitizenCon needs to act as a major annual update for all players that can't keep up with the usual development. It should offer us the ability to hear more in-depth explanations and plans from the devs that are too busy to chime in otherwise, and it should set expectations for the next year and the end goal of the game. It's still not perfect, but it is well on its way towards that role. Overall, it may be weird for an unreleased game to have an annual convention, but the project depends on CIG being able to adequately communicate all the details surrounding Star Citizen. And whether that's in a bombastic, marketing-focused fashion or a more concise and efficient informational style, it has continued to meet the need every year and will likely go nowhere anytime soon. With no keynote in 2022 and another digital convention, it's clear the company is crunching hard to finish their work rather than put more effort into the show outside of information. It'll be interesting to see where the company takes this anniversary event after this year. While I didn't dive super deep into the details of each year's event, I hope this gave you the gist of the theme and vibe of each year. While this event has occurred every year, it has changed and transformed in its presentation and goal. If you enjoy more in-depth, informational, and high-quality videos like this, and you aren't a supporter already, consider joining as a YouTube channel member or a Patreon member down below. And if you do support my work, thank you for making these possible as a job and for allowing me to continue making these in-depth videos that may not do as well publicly. I hope you learned something new in this video, and I'll catch you in the next one.